status of the loan program that was enacted by Senate Bill 3 during special session. We're going to have a discussion on our land grant permanent fund, and we are going to end the day with a discussion on creating an option to enroll in health insurance through the income tax system. This is our second to last meeting. Our last meeting will be in December. We do not have a November meeting, as you know. But December will definitely be a very packed agenda, so be ready for that. With that, members, why don't we get rolling? And I'm gonna ask our esteemed Cabinet Secretary for Taxation and Revenue, Stephanie Chardon Clark, as well as Mr. Richard Anklam and Ms. Susan Wood, to please take over. Thank you very much. Good morning to you all. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much to the committee for inviting us to be here. It's a real pleasure to update you on the status and the work of the two advisory committees related to tax that were created by the governor and I in late 2019. With me today are two members of the committees. Richard Anklam is, of course, the director of the Tax Research Institute, and he's a member of both committees. And then Suzanne Wood-Bruckner is an attorney with Sutton Thayer and Brown, and she is a member of the Tax Practitioner Advisory Committee. So I will be sharing my screen in a moment, and we'll go back and forth to give you the presentation, and then we'll be happy to stand for your questions. Okay, just make this a slideshow so it's a little bigger. Okay, I hope you can see that.
Yes, we can see that.
All right, without further ado, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So first we'll talk about the Tax Policy Advisory Committee. And this committee was created in October 2019. There's a section in the basically the Tax and Rev Act that allows for the creation of advisory committees. They can be created for 2 years for any purpose to advise the secretary or the governor. And so the Tax Policy Advisory Committee was created with the purpose of advising the governor and the secretary on matters of tax policy, including structural strengths and weaknesses in New Mexico's tax system, New Mexico's competitive advantages and disadvantages in taxation, and for purposes of talking about proposed statutory and regulatory improvements. And so far, the Tax Policy Advisory Committee, or what we call TPAC, has met 4 times, just about quarterly. And I've given for you here, just for your background, the membership. There are several members who are what we would call ex officio members. They're members as you know, because of their position they hold, not because of the individual. And that would be the secretary, the tax policy director, which is a vacant position within Tax and Rev right now, the chair of this committee, the chair of the House Taxation and Revenue Committee, the chair of the Senate Corporations and Transportation Committee, the directors of both the Municipal League and the Association of Counties. And then there are several members who are also appointed but not ex officio. They include Helen Hecht, who is with the Multi-State Tax Commission, Richard Anklam, James O'Neill, who's a former TRD secretary and tax policy director, James Jimenez of New Mexico Voices for Children, and then as also Senator Stephen Neville and Representative Jason Harper. Let's see. Okay, and next I will turn it over to Richard Anklam, who's going to talk about the work plan that the Tax Policy Advisory Committee adopted and the status. And Richard, whenever you're ready for a slide to turn, just let me know.
Great. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So I think in front of you now you have the first page of the Tax Policy Advisory Committee work plan as it's been progressing, and we'll just walk through it very quickly. You can see that it's color-coded for the tax policy principles that are involved, and what issues are implicated, whether they're statutory, regulatory, whether they need to be studied, whether it's a high or low or medium priority, Fiscal implications, which is obviously very important when considering your options. We have fewer options today than we had a year or two ago. But with all of that, you know, there's plenty of stuff to talk about. So item number one on the list is to ensure annual tax administration cleanup legislation. I know the department is working on that this year, and I know there's enough issues out there to make sure that that goal is met. I know in committee I've heard through the years over and over again that there's a desire to see this kind of cleanup legislation. No one likes to see the train wrecks and litigation explosions and things like that happen. So that's important, and I know everything's moving in that direction. July 1st, 2021 is when we fully implement the remote sales marketplace rules for gross receipts tax. And there may be regulatory changes, or there certainly will be some regulatory work needed to be done around that, as well as possible statutory changes. So that's a fairly high priority, and that's ongoing and being looked at. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Review the existing investment credit and proposed manufacturing equipment deduction. New Mexico is kind of an outlier. We don't have a real manufacturing equipment deduction. We have this credit, which is sometimes a Band-Aid, sometimes it's lucrative if you have an IRB, but it's something that should be looked at. It's been looked at in the past, but of course there's a cost associated with it. So the likelihood of something like that happening soon is not real high. Looking at revenue adequacy at the local level and the state level, of course, including big things like food and all of that. Those are perennial conversations. Nothing has been started on that sort of thing yet. I would add that in this age of COVID, everyone's attention and resources has been greatly distracted. So I think everyone's ability to make huge leaps and bounds progress has been curtailed somewhat by other priorities and distractions. But with that said, we need to keep the eye on the ball and keep things moving forward. Review the severance tax structure. It's very old, and we know there are problems in it. Not a controversial thing, just to get it cleaned up and consistent. I think the department may even be working on proposals for that in the present year. But there's cleanup that needs to be done, and it's ongoing changing needs. But that project hasn't really been started otherwise. Review the pit rate structure. We've heard that from committee members over and over again. We've had recent changes to capital gains and an increase, but there's conversations around exemptions for Social Security or military retirees, things of that nature. It's worth studying and looking at. It should be considered in conjunction with the low-income comprehensive tax rebate, as well as the working families tax rebate. And we need economists to look at that, to figure out how all of that comes together, who's affected, who's not, so we can start having that conversation. Again, that's an ongoing dialogue, but it's hard to focus resources on stuff like that at the moment. So it stays on the list, and we'll continue to work in that direction, hopefully. Next slide, Madam Secretary, please. Property tax lightening, that's another kind of perennial conversation that comes up. You all remember we had the 3% limitation, but that it solved some inequities and created others. Property tax in general is something that needs to be looked at. It's got moderate fiscal impact, but it's not really a priority. And that's not something that anyone's been able to focus on yet, but it is definitely, you know, on the list. Broaden the GRT base and lower the GRT rate. That's part of a broader kind of a tax reform conversation. It's really hard to do that in the fiscal environment that we're in. We know that there's a lot of deductions and exemptions out there that can be repealed, but most of them don't pay for a huge rate reduction. But we've seen significant rate increases, which impacts businesses and households alike. And we need to look at what we can do to perhaps change that. It's a big picture issue. It's not a high priority. It's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. I think the tax department is updating their tax expenditure report, and will present that fairly soon at LFC, and we're looking forward to seeing that. Reducing pyramiding, that's also a tax reform conversation that you all have heard before, and we all continue to have. Mostly it's targeted around things that we tax in terms of business inputs that other states don't. That's typically services, consumed services. But if you want to take care of that almost completely, it gets very, very expensive. Otherwise, you need to pick and choose and target. It's a good conversation to be having. There's been conversations about moving the 1.225 municipal distribution that's within the 5 1/8 state portion when you're within municipal boundaries. I think Representative Harper calls it truth in taxation, moving that out as an increment. So it's got big revenue impacts unless you do something to mitigate them. It's not a huge priority. Nothing's happened with that yet, but it's been a recent conversation and it's on the list. Review the corporate income tax rate structure. That's something else that probably should be done in context. Although we've recently, this year, after House Bill 6 recently, have implemented a brand new mandatory combined corporate income tax scheme, complete with, I don't mean scheme in a bad way, but a regime complete with transition provisions and all these kinds of things. We're in a horrible fiscal environment, so getting our arms around exactly what our corporate income tax base and structure looks like, I think is going to take some time. So we recognize that, so nothing has really started on that yet, but we expect that to be a future and ongoing conversation and something worth looking at. The next meeting of the group is going to be in, next slide, Madam Secretary, please. The next meeting of the group is going to be in December. We'll review the TRD proposed agency bills, as well as we'll be advised on drafts of TRD rulemaking proposals. The tax department has contracted with New Mexico Tax Research Institute, who's getting some additional assistance from Jim O'Neill and Helen Hecht, and trying to provide some support in the reg making process. So we're trying to focus on certain priorities like internet sales and the change to the corporate tax regime. Ms. Hecht has already provided an opus on that recently, and we continue to make progress, so we'll be advising on that as well. And with that, Madam Secretary, I will turn it over to you and Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Richard. I wanted to clarify one item for the record. The department will be on the LFC's late October agenda, but we won't be presenting a new release of the tax expenditure report on that date. We'll be talking about tax expenditures, but the new report won't be released until ahead of RESTEP's December meeting. All right, next. Turning our attention to the Tax Practitioner Advisory Committee now. This committee was also created in October of 2019, recognizing that tax practitioners and the department really need a regular communication method to make sure that we're understanding what they need, what we're doing that is and isn't working for them, and just brainstorming on how we can kind of work together to make everybody's lives easier and reduce burden on taxpayers as well. So the Tax Practitioner Advisory Committee, as we call it, TPRAC, advises the Secretary and the Governor on systemic issues related to our administration and enforcement of the tax code, trends in tax auditing and litigation, and potential process improvements in tax administration. And this committee has had a few less meetings than the Tax Policy Advisory Committee. We had planned to not have a meeting in the spring because, of course, for tax practitioners, meeting ahead of April 15th is just kind of a nightmare. So we didn't, but then the pandemic came and the filing deadlines were extended for 3 months. So it also wasn't a good time for them to meet in April, May, or June. But we did meet again recently at the end of September. Again, here's the membership. A few members are ex officio members. That would be the Secretary of TRD, the Deputy Secretary of TRD, and Emily Oster, who's a CPA and a former tax practitioner, plays a really a big role in organizing this committee. We also have our Chief Legal Counsel, Tim Van Valen, on this. And then there are several appointed members. Helen Hecht, again, from the Multi-State Tax Commission, Richard Englund. We have the Chief Hearing Officer, Brian Van Denzen, on this committee. A CPA in private practice, Bobby K. Nelson, Ms. Wood Bruckner, who's on the presentation panel today, Sam Baca, who is a CPA with Baca and Howard firm, and then Peter Wanko, who is the president of the New Mexico Society of Enrolled Agents, which are another form of tax practitioner, aside from lawyers and CPAs. And with that, I will turn it over to Suzanne to talk about the work plan that was adopted.
Suzanne, you are unmuted. You can go ahead. We cannot hear you, but you are unmuted on our end.
I don't know if we did an audio test with Suzanne. And if Suzanne is unable to have audio, I'm happy to walk through the work plan.
Yeah, I think we're playing some mute tech here, Secretary. Just stand by for a second.
Okay.
All right, Suzanne, you are unmuted. Can you try now? No, we still cannot hear you.
Mr. Chairman, would you like me to walk through the work plan?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. And Suzanne, if you're able to get audio while I'm in the middle, just interrupt me and I'll turn it back over to you. Okay, so this work plan is a little different than the TPAC, but similar. We've got our work plan items, kind of further notes on the status of that, the tax administration goals and principles. I can't help you right now, though. Sorry, I have 2 kids doing school right now, too. And then a status note on the far right. It wouldn't be a WebEx meeting to the presentation to the legislature without that.
Oh, absolutely. It's great. It's great.
So the first item on the work plan was the TPAC decided that we needed to survey practitioners and make sure that TRD was getting formal feedback from them, which we completed. There was a survey in August, and we highlighted the survey results highlighted basically that practitioners really need a reliable way to communicate with the department in writing and by email and by phone. Let's see, the next was they've highlighted the need for the department to improve its correspondence. And that is something that we also kind of self-identified in our strategic planning. We realized that, it's difficult. Sometimes the letters we send are not in plain English, and we kind of walk a balance between, we want to be very specific and precise in our language, and so that kind of leads itself to quoting statute. But then we end up with correspondence that is very readable for most recipients of our letters. So that's something we'll be working on. The TPAC had identified the need to expand the managed audit program, and we in fact have done that. Some of the changes are still in the process of being programmed in Gentax, but this is by and large completed. Basically, to recap, the managed audit program is where it's sort of, rather than a traditional field audit where the taxpayer receives a letter that they're about to be audited, under managed audit, the taxpayer comes forward voluntarily, reports to the department that they think they may be out of compliance, and then we work together collaboratively to bring the taxpayer into compliance. And in exchange for coming forward, the taxpayer has 180 days without penalty or interest. So we've just expanded that program. Previously, taxpayers had to waive their protest right, which was a real risk that the taxpayer was asked to take. We've done away with that. And we've also made it so that now, within a certain number of days from being approached for a field audit, the taxpayer can choose to opt into managed audit. So that should make it a more useful tool, and it's a de-escalated way to resolve issues with compliance. We've identified in the TPAC the need for staff training initiative, and we're looking at ways to partner with private sector to train TRD employees so that training goes both ways. Of course, we offer educational materials to taxpayers, but I think the department can learn a lot from also being trained by private sector sometimes. We're looking into creating a state and local tax certification program, which doesn't exist currently in New Mexico. And primarily right now, we're looking at creating a certification program with the NMH program. That's at the very beginning stages. We were asked by TPAC on this work plan to review TRD's position on, this is very wonky, admittedly, limiting use of non-taxable transaction certificates to a business engaged in more than one type of business at a time. And this had to do with there could be taxpayers who issued, or there could be sellers who issued 2 different types of NTTC. They might say that they were selling construction materials as well as tangible personal property at the same time. And TRD in the past had taken a position that was impossible, where of course it's possible. And so we revised that position and directed staff no longer to use that as a defense in protests and litigation. That's complete. Next, the TPRAC has put on the work plan to review TRD's treatment of software. This is basically a rule issue, and software has changed a lot over the years since that rule was put in place. So, and there are a lot of different ways software can be treated. Is it a license, or is it a sale of a service, et cetera? And so we're looking into that. And the rulemaking project that we have TRI on contract with us is including that in the scope of work. Next is establishing regulations related to internet sales and the Wayfair decision. Of course, that's the top priority that was listed on the TPAC work plan. And again, the department is working together with the Tax Research Institute on that rulemaking. Okay, next, we have noted on the work plan to review the regulations related to the corporate income tax. And again, a broken record right now. That's something that TRI is assisting us with, and Helen Hecht is doing a fantastic job on. Another item was repealing a certain section of the administrative code that is obsolete. It has to do with back when the Administrative Hearing Office was still within TRD. TRD never repealed its rules related to the Administrative Hearing Office when that was moved out several years ago. Let's see, clarification of GRT with regard to reimbursed expenditures. This is potentially something that needs legislative fix, and it might come with a negative fiscal impact. So that's a little potentially tough to do right now, but it is recognized by both practitioners and the department as a recurring source of dispute and litigation. Similarly, disclosed agents. This is another thing that we feel confident we could prevent a lot of litigation and protest by clarifying the rules around disclosed agents in the GRT Act. But again, this would cost a few $1 million, which makes it difficult at this time. Another need identified by TPRAC was for greater education and training available from TRD about the PIT B form. This has to do with treatment of out-of-state income and credit for taxes paid to other states. And we, in fact, have completed this. It's available online, and we're getting it up on a brand new TRD YouTube channel. Let's see, reviewing TRD's handling of incomplete returns. This we've come a long way on. The prior administration had rejected tax returns if a driver's license number was not attached, and we've administratively done away with that process. So now a return would not be rejected any longer for lack of a driver's license. Let's see, consider establishing a mediation process. This is an interesting one, and again, we're always looking for ways that we can de-escalate things and resolve issues between the department and taxpayers at the lowest level possible. And so potentially bringing on a third-party mediator could prevent a lot of things from making it all the way to the protest hearing process. And sometimes I think what we find is that a dispute will get all the way to the protest hearing, and at the hearing, it becomes evident that if a few people had just been able to get on the phone and talk for a few minutes, they might have been able to withdraw the dispute. So we haven't started that yet. This is something we'd probably be further along towards researching if it weren't for COVID, but we are not there yet. Expanding TRD's new informal public outreach process. This is something we started in the spring of 2019, and I really want to credit our Deputy Secretary, Emily Oster, for spearheading this initiative. But she's really keen at finding ways to make sure that we get informal public comment, for example, before something goes to rulemaking, and just making the department more accessible for tax practitioners and others. And so we continue to find ways that we can survey the world about what we're doing. We recently did that around the tax practitioner survey, but we also did a survey just recently on a CRS redesign IT project that's currently going on within the department, and the feedback we got was, I think, very helpful. Review the duration of audit selection. Practitioners, want the department to basically consider that, although we have the statutory right to go back, several years, maybe we should start with a shorter period of time, like it was suggested 3 years versus 6. This is a tough one. I can see why practitioners, in thinking about taxpayers and the record keeping, would want us to consider auditing a shorter period of time. But then I guess if I'm the general fund or the city of Albuquerque or Mora County, I wouldn't want the department to just give up on longer years because of revenue impacts. So that's something we'll certainly review the process on, though. The next one is underway. I mentioned a moment ago, we have a CRS redesign project in the works. And basically the combined reporting system has been in place as long as anyone can remember. And so that means that there's one single return on which GRT, comp tax, and withholding are reported. And we received C2 funding, non-recurring funding, in the last legislative session to redesign that project. Basically, the combined nature of those results in a lot of payments posting in error, returns not posting correctly, and a lot of rework that's burdensome for both the department and the taxpayer. And so by separating out those programs, we can ensure that the GenTax system consumes the returns and payments correctly on the front end, requiring less rework. And so that is something that's underway right now, and we have a target completion of 7/1/2021. Next, it's been suggested that we allow the smallest businesses with a very small amount of receipts to file annually their GRT and comp tax on their PIT return instead of having to file monthly or quarterly. I think this is something that would require a statutory change, and we're not there yet, but it is on the work plan, something to consider to ease taxpayer burden while not dramatically impacting government cash flow. And then the last item on the work plan, tax practitioners have suggested we need to program into GenTax to automatically send tax practitioners a notice whenever their client receives a notice. And what we've been told is, if a client gets an adverse notice, they're very likely to pick up the phone and call their tax practitioner and say, what do we do? We have a problem. But when they get a positive notice and the case can be closed out, the practitioner might not hear, and then they still have, that item on their work plan. And so it would just notify them that it's been resolved. So to talk a little bit more about the survey results that we did, I mentioned we surveyed tax practitioners in August. We received 25 responses. And to very, very quickly summarize the results, practitioners expressed that they really need TRD to be accessible for their communication and responsive by phone and email. They would like to see continued improvement in customer service. I think they would probably, on the whole, would report that they've seen some improvement in customer service over the last year and a half, but that we can still do better in terms of just courtesy, politeness, and basic customer service. And so, we are making available, especially online during the pandemic, customer service training for staff. But there's no magic bullet to kind of make that so overnight, but we're working on it. Practitioners see a need for TRD to always have adequate staffing and then as well as technical training, which is a challenge for us ongoing. And they also highlighted in their August survey the need for many recently completed initiatives, which to me makes it clear that we need to do a better job of communicating what we have done already to fix for them. They noted that we need to expand our acceptance of electronic signatures, which we've done. We need to make call center improvements, which we did. And I'm actually happy to report in the first quarter of FY 2021, our wait time to reach the tax call center was less than 4 minutes on average, which is great. It used to be over 30 minutes and sometimes more like 45. We have already simplified the taxpayer information authorization form. That's the one where basically a practitioner fills out a form with their client that allows us to disclose the client's information to the practitioner. For various reasons, those forms used to only be good for 1 year, which created a lot of burden for both tax practitioners and their clients and the department to redo these forms every year when now we can accept them for a longer period of time. And then last, they highlighted the need to be able to do payment agreements through TAP online, and we actually put that online during the pandemic. So several hundred taxpayers have been able to enter their own payment agreement with TRD since the pandemic started and not need to come into a field office to do that. And that concludes the presentations that we prepared for you today, and the three of us are happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Suzanne. I'm sorry we weren't able to hear you. I apologize for those technical difficulties, but we'll keep working at it. We're getting better. We're getting better at this WebEx thing. Are there questions from committee members in the chamber? Are there questions from people participating through WebEx? If you have a question on WebEx, just raise your hand on there or chat at me. Madam Secretary, Richard, and Suzanne, thank you so much. So I'm a relatively new member to the advisory committee, but I have to say that it's been very informative for me to be a part of this committee with folks who really know and understand tax policy from both a policy perspective, but also from practitioner's perspective, and I think that's important. I appreciate all the good work that's gone into not only the presentation but into these work plans. Madam Secretary, in terms of the TPAC, the Tax Policy Advisory Committee, how long is the mandate for?
So, Mr. Chairman, the statute under which these advisory committees are created says that they can last for 2 years. And I'm sure that if the work was still ongoing at the end of 2 years, they could be reestablished. But right now, that's what I have in mind, is through about October 2021. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And in terms of the policies that are, and I guess I shouldn't call them policies, but the items on the work plan, do you have I understand that we don't really have a list yet of things that will be proposed in 2021, is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, not yet. TRD has proposed several administrative cleanups. Setting aside revenue generating proposals, I'm not talking about that. We've proposed several administrative cleanup concepts that could all potentially be rolled into one omnibus bill. But the dialogue is still ongoing on the executive side as far as what agency bills will be put forth. But I guess I will add, Mr. Chairman, at the last TPAC and TPREC meetings, I was able to review those proposals at a very high level with the members.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And you know what, I think our fiscal situation begs the question, right? When the advisory committee was created, I think obviously the fiscal situation was very different, and I'm wondering, have those policy, from the executive perspective, have those policy considerations changed because of the fiscal environment that we're in right now?
Well, Mr. Chairman, there's a couple different ways I could answer that. On one hand, I could go back to the comments that Richard Anklam made, that there are some proposals particularly on the Tax Policy Advisory Committee work plan, where we can see that something would be a good policy. The fiscal impacts of it right now are prohibitive. A couple that come to mind, well, of course, whenever you talk about tax policy and tax reform in New Mexico, people automatically think about, okay, close GRT loopholes and lower the rate. That's kind of, in my opinion, an oversimplification. And when you look at the actual loopholes that exist and how much revenue is foregone for each one, you would be very hard pressed to find loopholes that could be closed that would generate significant revenue to pay for a rate decrease. It just the math just isn't there. Unless people want to tax things that would be terrible to tax. But that said, there are a few smaller to more moderate tax policy changes that do have a negative fiscal impact, but not to that great extent. Some of them that come to mind are the investment or the manufacturing equipment deduction, which is expensive, but not so much so. Another one is the problem that tax practitioners in the department continue to butt heads against is the disclosed agent issue. It's sort of seen as a gotcha in New Mexico tax policy that, disclosed agent is basically a third party who receives money on behalf of someone else. And they're sort of, think of them as a middleman, like maybe an escrow company or something, or a staffing company. The money goes through them, but it might not be their receipts. And not to get too into the weeds, it leads to a lot of protests, a lot of litigation, and a lot of tax bills on unsuspecting taxpayers. And I think if Suzanne or Richard want to talk about that more, we do think that fixing that issue in the GRT definitions would probably cost something like $3 to $4 million, but it would be a really good step forward in terms of administering tax in New Mexico. Did you add anything?
I would agree with that. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes.
So sorry, everybody, about that. I would agree with that. The disclosed agency is a very big issue for taxpayers. A lot of times is what happens is because they don't see it as their receipts. They don't report it. They don't pass the tax on. And then 3 or 6 years later, they get audited and they get a pretty significant audit bill. And at that time, they can't afford to pay it because they haven't passed the tax on. And they don't understand it because tax was probably collected by the ultimate person who benefited. They probably paid the tax. So they see it, it's not really double tax, but they see it that way, so they don't understand it, which makes those kinds of conversations with clients difficult. And the department's hands are kind of tied because of the way the law works.
Sure. Richard, anything to add?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. This has been an issue. It's actually a variety of issues. It's touched in a few different places, but it's been a problem my entire career in tax in New Mexico. So it's not a new issue, but it's been unresolved for much too long. So it would be nice to get some closure on this sooner rather than later, if possible.
Sure. Thank you all. Over the last, I want to say 8-10 months, I've been approached by a number of people, some of them who actually want to present to this committee, folks who have been involved in these types of commissions and blue ribbon committees in the past. My question for all three of you all is, how do we ensure that this particular effort is different from those other ones? And not to say that those other ones didn't yield results. I mean, I'm sure they did at some level. But what I've heard from constituents in particular who have been involved in these efforts in the past is that a lot of good work was put in by practitioners, by experts, by community members, and then, reports were left on a bookshelf somewhere to collect dust. How do we ensure that doesn't happen with this process?
Who wants to go first, Mr. Chairman?
Take your pick.
I'm happy to tell you from my perspective in the practitioner committee, I think the secretary and her staff have done a very good job of creating a work plan with specific action items. And some of those action items have already been implemented, like, for example, the survey. Another one that doesn't require statutory change, which I think is really good, is the change to the managed audit program. The legislature gave us the managed audit program several years ago. It's been very successful. The changes that are being implemented now will make that even more attractive, I think, to taxpayers. I think getting people into compliance under that program is much cheaper, both for taxpayers and the department, and results in less litigation. So at least, the practitioner committee has some statutory changes that they would like to see, which is Richard and the secretary have said are expensive, but there's a lot of other things that the department can just do on its own. And I think one of the big differences now, they're asking people, what can we do? How can we make it better? You've been doing this a long time. What changes should we make? They're listening, and then they're taking action.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would echo what Ms. Bruckner said. I think I've been involved in some of those prior tax reform commissions, and most of them have been very broad, big picture, big reform kind of approaches, which is very, very difficult. Some weren't as serious as others in reality as well. I think some were just done for the sake of doing and educating, but not with the goal of actually accomplishing something. In this case, there are much more targeted things that can be done, perhaps administratively. We're trying to get feedback from practitioners in the case of TPRAC, as well as bigger policy issues. But it's not huge tax reform, I think, that anyone's trying to bite off and chew on. It's these little pieces that we can all work on together over time, where a piecemeal approach, or I shouldn't say piecemeal, but step-by-step as we can do it approach makes some sense, and we can continue the conversation. I think it ought to be an ongoing conversation, and I applaud the department, the governor, and this committee for supporting that effort.
Mr. Chairman, I'll only add, the sentiment that I will add is part of creating these committees that I knew would be a problem and something I needed to do is manage expectations for the very reason you noted. To go about, working with an advisory committee over 2 years with the expectation that we're going to somehow reform GRT as a whole, or that these committees will, for example, result in a constitutional amendment that balances our dependence on property tax and GRT. I would not be managing expectations. And so from the beginning, I've tried to stress that there are plenty of small and medium-sized reforms that can happen administratively and statutorily. And one of the things that has been most helpful of having the advice of these committees has been the resounding support for an annual administrative cleanup bill. Both practitioners and the tax policy folks, as well as your committee, Mr. Chairman, are constantly bringing up the importance of that. And as a result, we were able to really set aside a lot of time and effort within the department to study that. And I really hope that we'll be coming forward with a really strong proposal for the next regular session.
Yes, I agree with everything you all said, and again, having participated in several of these meetings, I have to say, Madam Secretary, and your staff and yourself have done a tremendous job managing those expectations, and I feel keeping us focused. It's those are actually some of the most efficient meetings that I've been a part of in my time in the legislature, because they are focused on nuts and bolts, practical sort of issues, and even though the committee as we know, is very diverse in terms of its membership, we have not fallen into the trap of sort of ideological debates, which I think is important. My final question, Madam Chair, as you and as the two advisory committees solidify the work plan, do you expect to have bills ready by the December rest step meeting for endorsement by the committee?
Mr. Chairman, yes, that is my hope and my goal.
And you mentioned earlier the potential for an omnibus bill. Is that what you would bring to this committee, or would you bring these sort of piecemeal and then maybe package them together during the session?
Mr. Chairman, I could go either way on that. I do think that there are too many individual proposals to be able to run through a session and get them through and staff all the committees. So they have to be packaged together somewhat, and I would be open to direction as far as whether they should be in all one or maybe 2 or 3. But I think particularly given the specter of a virtual session, so with presentations to committees happening remotely, the fewer bills probably the more effective.
Yeah, no, that's probably good thinking. And I'm not exactly sure how the session's gonna operate given the pandemic and where we might be from a public health perspective come January. But I think that's very, it's likely that, we'll be unable to entertain too many bills. Anything else from community members? All right. Well, thank you, Secretary Chardon Clark. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Suzanne. And by the way, Secretary, love seeing kids and sometimes pets. I do the same thing. If I were at home, that would have happened about 4 times to me. Because my kids, I think, are a little younger than yours, so they tend to be more in my face sometimes. But have a great rest of your day. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. We appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. All right, members, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do before we continue with the agenda. The first item is if you want to receive per diem and mileage reimbursement for this meeting, you have to email Pam Stokes and you have to tell her explicitly that you would like reimbursement for mileage and per diem. That's the rule that they employed upstairs, and if you don't do that, you're not gonna receive reimbursement. So please do so if you wish to receive it. Secondly, we have 2 sets of minutes, and for those of you that are in the chamber, did you get a copy of the minutes? They should be in your email, but there are also hard copies up here if you need them. And we have minutes for the August 7th meeting, and we have minutes for the September 22nd meeting. So if we can take a couple of minutes just to go through those, and then I'll entertain motions to approve those minutes. Let's do August 7th first. We have a motion for approval by Vice Chair Sanchez. Is there a second? Seconded by Senator Campos. Is there opposition to that motion? Seeing none, August 7th meeting minutes have been approved. I don't have a gavel, so I'll use my phone. It's got insurance. September 22nd. We have a motion for approval of September 22nd minutes by Vice Chair Sanchez. Is there a second? Seconded by Representative Chandler. Is there opposition to that motion? Seeing none, September 22nd meetings have been approved. So next on the agenda, members, we have an overview of the loan program, Senate Bill 3, and we've got Ms. Marquita Russell, the CEO for the New Mexico Finance Authority, and I believe she is on the line.
I am, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here.
Good morning, Ms. Russell. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and I'm joined today by my Chief of Program Operations, Adam Johnson. I'm not sure how many of you have had the pleasure of meeting Adam. He was with our agency, several years ago and then rejoined us in February. So we are happy to have him back on board. And he'll walk through the end of the presentation that's been provided to us today. I think you can all see my screen, so I'll just get started. As you know, the special session was successful in passing the Small Business Recovery Act of 2020. It created 2 programs within the NMFA that are funded by a distribution of severance tax permanent funds. The first program is the Local Government Emergency Economic Relief Program, and that program is a $50 million earmark that provides revenue replacement loans for cities and counties that experienced a 10% decline in GRT over the 4th quarter of fiscal year 2020, so April through June. We received the June distribution information in August, and it is clear to us that there's not a strong need for this program. There are, I think, roughly $25 million of potential loans because under the program we can loan up to 50% of that decline. Several large counties and cities would make up the majority of that 25 million, and there were even a few small communities that maybe would have loans of less than $100. So at this point, we do not believe that a program is necessary. We've not been contacted by any of the potential applicants, and we have been in contact directly with some of the larger communities. We don't see a need for that. So at this point, we have focused our energy solely on the implementation and administration of the Small Business Recovery Loan Fund. Now, this is a loan fund that received an earmark of $400 million from the Severance Tax Permanent Fund, and it provides loans to small businesses that experienced financial hardship at the beginning of the public health order. We have, Finance Authority has entered into a memorandum of understanding with the State Investment Council, and $100 million of that $400 million earmark has been deposited with the NMFA, and we are currently making loans from that program. For those of you who haven't been part of some of my earlier presentation, I will go through just sort of the highlights of what the Act requires. The Act defines a qualifying small business as a business or nonprofit corporation that closed or reduced operations due to the public health order, had annual gross revenues of less than $5 million as determined by the 2019 tax year, experienced a 30% decline in monthly gross receipts or monthly revenues in each of April and May of 2020 as compared to those same months in 2019. And it's important that you recognize that there are two tests in that one set of criteria, which is that there must be a 30% decline for April and a 30% decline for May. So we can't average the decline over the 2-month period. It's a one-on-one test. And then ultimately the last eligibility requirement is that NMFA must determine that the borrower is creditworthy. For-profit businesses can be sole proprietors, partnerships, any legal form of business entity. If you are for-profit, you must be able to demonstrate that at least 80% of the ownership is with New Mexico residents. So there needs to be ownership and control with New Mexico residents. And then lastly, if you are a nonprofit, you can be either a 501c3, which is a charitable organization, or 501c6, which is one of the associations, such as the Chamber of Commerce. The terms themselves are laid out in statute, very clear. The loan amount is 2 times the monthly average expenses, not to exceed $75,000. The interest rate is half of prime rate. Prime rate right now is 3.25%. So the interest rate on these loans is 1.625%, and that's fixed for the life of the loan. There's no collateral on these. There's no requirement for a personal guarantee or anything else. In fact, the statute is explicit that I cannot take a personal guarantee or any collateral. The Act provides for 3-year loans to be made that are interest only, with interest paid annually. So the first payment is due a year after we close on the loan, and that is an interest payment. Principal's due at maturity, so at the end of that 3-year period. But at the borrower's request, the law allows for me to stretch out those loan payments over another 3 years and then have it become an amortizing loan where monthly principal and interest is paid. There's some reporting requirements. They need to report to the Finance Authority on job creation or job data and on any bankruptcy action. We are currently providing the funding solely through an electronic method, which is the automated clearinghouse. So upfront, as part of the application, we receive information about the applicant's bank account. We make sure it's valid at the time that we approve the loan application, and then we're able to disperse very quickly to that same account. And that account needs to be held at in the name of the borrower and at a federally insured depository institution. And then lastly, the Act provides that the funding can be used for any ordinary expenses. However, the amount that's used for owner salaries is limited. So owner salaries can't be more than 20% of that loan. There was a lot of beauty in the clarity of the legislation because we at the Finance Authority didn't have to make any determination about the size of the loans, the terms of the loans, revenue amounts, those sorts of eligibility issues. We were able to focus our efforts on on quickly implementing a program that was efficient, that reduced potential for fraud, and that was easy for clients who have been hit hard by economic downturns. These were difficult times. These are difficult times. We certainly didn't want a bureaucratic loan program to add to the pain of our New Mexico businesses. So we really saw this as a sort of operations and communication effort, and not so much a typical loan program where we're focused more on underwriting. The eligibility criteria here is very clear on who gets the loan. We looked at other programs to try to figure out what kind of demand to expect. So we looked at statewide programs, statewide loan programs in particular, and found that there was a lot of differences as to how this was handled. There were more citywide programs than statewide programs. A lot of the statewide programs focused on grants, which wasn't helpful in this particular instance. So we found very little peer data. We did find a couple of other things. One was that most of the states implemented programs right after their public health orders were initiated. So we saw a lot of them actually payment protection program, loan program. So that's the program offered by the SBA. That was opened up in very early April, like April 4th or so. And we saw actually loan programs in place at states before that. There were some similarities in that all of these programs have similar collateral requirements, which is none, have very low or no interest rates, and required very little documentation up front. So that was consistent amongst all the emergency programs. But we didn't find any other state that had, that certainly of a comparable population level, that put as much investment into their local businesses. I'll show you some peer data here in a second. And what we ultimately found was that New Mexico's eligibility criteria was far more focused than other states, and other states had a little more flexibility in how they were able to operate their program. I would say, though, that one of the nice parts about not having flexibility is that we've been able to make a program that applicants know upfront whether they're going to qualify or not, that there's not a lot of confusion surrounding it, there's not a black box that's determined, and that we could do this relatively quickly. So our program, as we'll run through in a minute, we were able to open the program up within 29 days, the legislation being signed, and make our first loan within 31 days. So the clarity of the statute was very helpful in that regard. Here are some of the peer programs that we found. You'll note New Jersey, which obviously is much larger than New Mexico, had only allocated $10 million to their program. Their program required a 20% decline and be at least a year old. The maximum amount of loan there is $100,000. So that's probably one of the closest we have in terms of being able to determine similar eligibility. Connecticut offered a $50 million program. Their max loan is about half of ours, or 3 months of monthly expenses. Businesses there need to have shown profitability prior to the pandemic, and that they aren't allowing any sin businesses, which are typically liquor establishments, golf courses, things like that. I'm never sure how golf course gets into sin business, but it does. North Carolina Rapid Recovery Loans, again, $90 million for that program. That's actually a program that's already been retooled. So they initially began with a $50,000 limit, and they are now at a $250,000 limit, or 2 times the monthly expenses. So they significantly increased the amount that each business was eligible for. The interest rate started out at 4%, and it's now at 0.25%. So they went from 4 down to 0.25%, and they simplified their criteria. They simply have to be a North Carolina business and to demonstrate negative impact. So you've got on the very last column there our information, and this is as of October 8th. I think we're right around 500 loans now, and the average loan size has stayed relatively consistent. Other statewide programs you'll see on the very far side of that page, on page 6, very little money put to these programs, New York being the largest with a $100 million program statewide. So you can see that New Mexico really did invest in its businesses, certainly compared to other states. So for operating purposes, the Finance Authority set up a program that could handle a large onslaught of applications. We assumed between 5,000 and 7,500 loans. Again, apropos of nothing, we did not have a context for which to do this, so we chose to develop a process that allowed us to do these as efficiently as possible with as few what we'll call finger touches as possible to decrease the possibility for error and to ensure that it could happen, that data and information could go system to system and not have to go through individuals. So that's how we set up this program. The application itself is offered online at our website, which is nmfinance.com. It's available in both English and Spanish. There's a lot of sort of video tutorials on how to submit the program. Frequently asked questions, again, in English and Spanish, are available on that site as well. Pursuant to the Act, applications are available through the end of December, and we are, at this point, we believe we will have sufficient funds. We are not seeing the kind of demand that we think would utilize all 400 million. So we expect to be able to keep this program open through the end. And then I would note that the statute also provides one other element, which is that banks, credit unions, and community development financial institutions, those alternative lenders, are also able to participate with us in the program by serving as what the statute calls a loan servicer, but really is a loan reviewer in the sense that they're looking at the information provided by the applicant and the documents provided by the applicant and ensuring that they are consistent and accurate, and then they report their findings to the NMFA. This particular partnership would have been very important if we had seen the level of applications that we had initially determined. So again, we set up the program believing that we might need to take on a large volume of applications. Loan servicers would have been very critical in that. I'd note that we, had nice broad geographic dispersion of the banks that were interested and the credit unions and CDFIs that were interested in participating, though I think ultimately we ended up with fewer than 20 institutions. The application is held on a third-party site, and we chose this site because of its ability to use their document processing. So everything gets submitted by the applicant, again, verified by another individual before we go to make the loan. But that information that's been input by the applicant, reviewed by the loan reviewer, is ultimately then baked into the documents that the system will generate. So everything happens through this encrypted site. Applications come in, all the personal information that's provided is in this secure encrypted site. Documents go out through that site. Electronic signatures are provided through that site. So it's all very enclosed into the FormStack system. It also allows us to use some logic in asking the right questions. So as you recall, there are both nonprofits and for-profits that are eligible for this program. The kind of tax document you might use for a nonprofit is very different than a for-profit. So we're able to, the application actually changes based on the prior information received. The other thing that it does is that it allows for some calculations to occur so that it can immediately inform the applicant if they've provided information that makes them ineligible for the program. So the first eligibility is whether or not they have revenues of less than $5 million. We ask for the revenues. If the applicant fills out $5,001 and above, then it's informed immediately. The applicant gets a notice that says that your revenues are greater than $5 million, and that makes you ineligible for the application. We are still requesting that applicants fill out some of the demographic information so we can capture the kind of information that you all might need as policymakers about who was unable to participate in the program but wanted to. So there is still a request for them to finish the application, or at least a portion of it, and hit submit so we can capture that data. In some instances, they just hit submit. Some instances, they filled it out. So we have some good demographic data, but it is still obviously a little incomplete because it was based on the applicant's desire to continue to fill out the application. The second piece of eligibility, as you may recall, is the 30% decline. And so we look at and ask for the receipts, the CRS reports that are provided to Taxation and Revenue for the months of April and May of 2019 and April and May of 2020. They put those numbers in there, and then their FormStack does an automatic calculation and is able to tell the applicant what the level of decline is. If they don't meet that 30% test in each of those months, similarly, they're given a notice that they are unable to proceed because they don't meet the eligibility criteria. So those are two pieces of logic that are built into the system. So you'll see later on that we're able to provide you with some snapshot as to why applicants were not able to move forward if they were not successful. What we are collecting, what we have to collect, obviously, is the gross annual revenues of the small business. We ask for employment data. We're asking for their March 1st, 2020 data, their employee numbers at the time that they submit the application, and then we're asking them to project forward to March 1st of 2021. So we're looking at pre-pandemic, middle of the application, and what we really hope to be post-pandemic, so that you can see the relative, the impact of the public health order, the pandemic, to date, and their expectations, either their pessimism or optimism about moving forward. We're also asking for industry information. We have county information, so we can provide you with regional data. We ask applicants to estimate how they're going to use the funds, whether it's going to be for mortgages, marketing, COVID-related expenses, salaries, that sort of thing. And then some basic demographic information about the business owners so that you can see who's applying and who's being served. Pursuant to the Small Business Recovery Act, the only information we're able to provide you specifically is the name of the loan recipient. All other information is reported in broad demographic terms, as you'll see here in a second. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam Johnson. Adam, are you on? Do I see you?
Good morning, Ms. Russell, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Good morning. We can hear you fine. Thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you. Before I dive into some of the statistics here, starting on slide 10, slide 10's a little outdated. The Finance Authority updates the funding and approval statistics for the Small Business Recovery Loan Fund a couple of times a week. And so on our website at nmfinance.com, you'll find an updated version of slide 10. We are, as Ms. Russell mentioned, just at about 500 approved loans, 409 to be exact, at just about $23.25 million, just a little bit over $23.25 million. The rest of the statistics on this slide still essentially hold, with our average loan just being a little bit below $47,000. And the smallest and largest loans being a rather small amount, actually right now at $496, and then the max amount under the statute at $75,000. And one of the things that I'd like to point out here is the top industries in the program to date have been the three that you see before you, which is still consistent with the data that's up to date on our website. We're going to be looking at some relationships with these top industries in the data today. One of the things I'd like to highlight that's not in the slides that I don't want to be lost on the committee and or the public or anybody else that's participating in the presentation today is while we did design a process that was intended to be highly efficient, safeguarded for fraud, and able to process a very high volume of applications for the business owners in the state of New Mexico. We also have a team of very nice, personable people that have been taking many calls and emails throughout this process to take questions and to help applicants through the process. As you can imagine, there are folks that have figured out that the application is, if you will, smart, And so they have learned to answer questions a certain way so that they can get past and get to a human to have a conversation about various justifications. And so we have evidence of this. We have another process on the side that we allow for communications with the applicants to send us additional information in a secure and encrypted fashion in a different form that's hosted on FormStack. And just to show the little, I guess, white glove touch, if you will, that we're taking to make sure that business owners in New Mexico don't feel like a number, but are actually being treated with the respect that they're due. And so with that, if we could proceed to the next slide. We have before you on slide 11 some breakdowns of the annual revenue and the loan amounts. On the top of the slide, what you can see is by far the majority of the applicants in the Small Business Recovery Loan Fund, their annual revenue is less than $500,000. I would suggest that statistic would highlight I think the spirit of the laws passed by the legislature, that it was highly targeted for small businesses, and we see a high number of those being successful at that revenue level, followed by the 500,000 to $1 million, and then the $1 million to $2.5 million, and then the numbers significantly decrease as the revenue figure climbs. On the next set of statistics, you'll find in the loan amount, we have more of a barbell look to the count. As you can see, between 0 and about 30,000 or 29,000, we have a high number of 35% of the approved applications, and then the other majority of the cluster is at the $75,000 amount, or the maximum loan amount as required under the statute. And the 75,000 count is indicative of the relationship with a high amount of success of applicants in the retail, food and accommodation sectors, with respect to that they tend to have high expenses, and those high expenses are include usually a generally significant number of cost of goods sold that we take into account. And while they likely don't enjoy a very high profit margin on those businesses, such as restaurant, retail, and hotels, they certainly have a lot of expenses in order to make their operations work, and we see that in the numbers. And then lastly, provided for you on this slide is the number of applicants that do have CARES Act loans, or also known as the PPP or EIDL loans. We do not take into account grants with the CARES Act program, but we do take into account the loans, and those are actually subtracted from the calculation that comes up with the 2 times monthly expense amount, which ultimately becomes the loan amount. And then lastly, just for purposes of reporting, we also collect the number of the recipients that have outstanding bank loans. We don't use that information in any way, shape, or form to determine creditworthiness. It's simply a statistic that we choose to collect for reporting purposes. On slide 12, you'll see a graphical depiction of one of the concepts that Ms. Russell mentioned with regards to the collection of the number of employees. As you can see in the projected number, the mint green bar graph, you can see that as maybe no surprise to anybody in this conversation, that New Mexicans tend to be optimists, and they are showing and seeing a brighter future on hopefully the maybe not the end, but a different phase of this world that we live in March of 2021, having an anticipated higher number of employees than when they began the application. I also sort of theorize that folks have also, where you see that number dropping in the 0 to 1 employees, that what you're actually seeing is them moving to one of the greater numbers, the 2 to 5, or perhaps the 6 to 10. But we are collecting this data to provide a point of reference for both the starting point and a projected ending point, and we look to collect actual data in the future to see if it supports the optimism that took place when the applications were filled out. On the next slide, some of the other information that we've collected both for compliance purposes and for reporting purposes is we did select some of them probably more known, diverse business classifications that we collect. And we can see here that over 50% of the applicants in the program have self-selected as identifying with one of those 4 types of classifications. And so this information is provided for reporting purposes to show that, to the extent that the spirit of the law is intended, is reaching various different types of businesses throughout the state. On the right hand, we have a table that's an aggregation of the information that's collected with a self-reporting request of the way that the proceeds of the loan will be used. As you recall from Ms. Russell's earlier statements and from the law, that the only requirement of how the proceeds are used is that they will be used for ordinary business expenses, and the maximum amount that would be contributed to salaries of equity owners not exceed 20%. Other than that, the rest of the proceeds of the loan can be used for ordinary business expenses. The Finance Authority chose to classify those in the categories as provided before you, not to get too elaborate, but to allow, again, for the small business owner to give us an estimate, if you will, for the use of the proceeds. I can comment from our interactions with borrowers, they're rather relieved that this is a request or an estimate and not a number that they're specifically being necessarily held to, with the exception of the salaries for owners, that we just want to know a starting point, and then in the future find out how the proceeds were actually spent, to see how the loan program was most useful for business owners throughout the state. Slide 14, as of October 6th, shows the total applications in the system that had been in one of 3 categories as pending, ineligible, or eligible. And then we've aggregated those numbers across based upon the legal form of business that the business reported to us. The numbers that we see, the highest amount is in the LLCs and the single member LLCs. Single member LLCs are often the same as the sole proprietorship. It's just that for purposes of the way they're organized, that they are an LLC, but they often, for federal tax reporting purposes, are reporting as a sole proprietorship. By far and away, these categories make up the applicants for the Small Business Recovery Loan Fund. You'll notice a bit of a tepid response in the nonprofit area. We're certainly interested in increasing the knowledge and education about the program, specifically for nonprofits, so that we hope to make sure that they have a clear understanding of whether or not this is a method that would be a solution for their current operations in this environment. And we hope to be able to receive more applications if in fact they deem that is a good solution for them. But we've been surprised a little bit by the tepid response that we've received to date. On slide 15, we do collect the industry code that small businesses report for both their federal tax reporting purposes and their state of New Mexico tax reporting purposes. We chose to use the highest level of this reporting code. It's the same code that is used at the high level for New Mexico tax and rev, in order to classify the various industries that are applying to the Small Business Recovery Loan Fund. As I mentioned earlier on, you can see that the lion's share of the applicants, and in this case, the approved applications by industry, come from food and accommodations, retail, arts, entertainment, and recreation. And then the arts, entertainment, and recreation is actually tied for third with the other services, which is also at 10%. These industries, as you'll see, have not only been the highest number of industries that we see having success in the program, but are actually also the top industries that are not having success in the program. And we have some interesting data to be reviewed with that concept in mind here in this slide deck. On slide 16 here, the total number of applications by county, including how they've been deemed eligible, ineligible, and or pending at the time that this snapshot was taken, which again was on October 6th. As you can see, and I think is to be anticipated, certainly I anticipated that we would see a high number of applications from the more populated population centers of the state, being Bernalillo County and Santa Fe County. However, I think have been a bit surprised by a couple of nuances in the data and look for improvement in these areas. And we were surprised by the low number of applications coming from one of our other larger population centers, being Doña Ana County. And then in general, the response of applications coming from the rural areas of the state. And so while what we've provided to you is some high-level data and some discussion points around some of the reasons why we think this may be the case, it's not to be supplemented for the fact that we are and have been endeavoring in significant communication and outreach efforts to get this program and its details in front of business owners, whether they are in largely populated areas or sparsely populated areas of the state. And we hope to be able to see an increase in folks that would utilize the program should they find it as a viable solution for their business in all areas of the state, and it not be dominated necessarily based on population alone. So earlier in the presentation, Marquita, Ms. Russell was highlighting the requirements of the law with regards to the qualifications. And so within those qualifications, we essentially have a standard by which at least 80% of the ownership must be a resident of New Mexico. We evidence that using personal tax returns filed to the state of New Mexico, and in the majority of cases, the other requirement being that gross revenue not exceed $5 million. And then the last requirement being that at least a 30% decline have occurred in April and May of 2020 as compared to April and May of 2019. And this has to be as required by the law and further elaborated in the rules of the Small Business Recovery Loan Fund by documents submitted to New Mexico Taxation and Rev in the form of their combined reporting for GRT. And as you can see, what we've been able to capture is the majority of folks having trouble accessing this pool of funds is related to meeting that 30% decline requirement in those 2 months. The Finance Authority has been able to work within the language provided to make sure that we are capturing and making some flexibility around folks that report both quarterly and semi-annually to the state of New Mexico, as well as working with borrowers, applicants, potential borrowers whom report on a cash basis and therefore may have some activity show up in those months that is actually related to prior months, and isolate that out so that we can do our best possible job to try to show the decline in the months as dictated by the legislation, and work with those folks with in those cases, especially when they've made deposits to their bank late and it's showing up as revenue in the wrong month, and types of things that I don't think simply could have been anticipated, but we're working closely with borrowers to try to help with. The slide before you shows the ineligible applications by county, and what we've been able to do is then slice that data by those categories of whether or not or which tests they did not pass. And so as no surprise, given the 71% of them being in the revenue and decline category, you can see that continues to be the trend as you look at it by county. I will note that we do have this other category. The majority or lion's share of the folks that have been deemed for purposes of reporting as not being eligible for other is generally because of the lack of documentation that's provided in the application. As I mentioned earlier, we go a number of extra steps to try to collect the documents that are required in order to be deemed ineligible or eligible, and in some cases, we're just not, we're not either able to reach the applicant or they're not actually able to produce the documents that are required. And so for those purposes, they've been deemed as other for not making the application process successful. So again, we see the concentration being in the higher areas, the higher populated areas of the state, as to be expected from just the overall volume coming from those areas of the state. On slide 19, looks strikingly similar to the slide previous that had the eligible applications by industry, but just again to share that those folks that are not making the application successfully are coming from the same three predominant industries of retail, food and accommodations, and arts, entertainment, and recreation. So along those lines, staff has taken some steps to do some additional analysis to try to understand, while we are making certain that we're doing significant outreach efforts to make sure that the program and its very flexible and generous terms, as well as the depth of the program, is understood throughout the state. Staff has also taken an approach to try to understand perhaps the forces in the economy that may prevent or make it difficult for the application to be successful based upon the various industries. And so we look to the data that's reported by Taxation and Rev, known as the RP80 data, that also reports out the gross receipts tax, the taxable gross receipt, one more time, the gross receipts not necessarily taxable, but the gross receipts is reported to Taxation and Rev, not to be confused with the taxable gross receipts that take into account deductions, because again, we're looking at the gross receipts and not the taxable gross receipts to evidence the decline. We found some interesting statistics within this data, and what you have before you is the three major industries that we see in the application. This is their data as reported in the RP80 for the year over the prior year change to the same month. And what we see is of those three top industries, actually only one of them during April and May, on average statewide, meets the decline necessary for the application. Now, again, when you dive into the data more granularly, you certainly do find sectors of, say, the accommodation or food services that do evidence a higher than 30%, but on average, when taken together, they actually don't reach that. We've drawn some of our own conclusions, not just from our experience, but also the very detailed and informative data that's been provided from the Legislative Finance Committee, showing some of the additional information that would support ideas around that. At the same time in which we are taking the temperature, if you will, of the gross receipts tax being reported, is the same time period in which the state was receiving a significant stimulus via the federal loan programs through the CARES Act, the uptick and increase in unemployment benefits that was taking place at that time, as well as the direct federal transfers of payments, all of which have essentially created if you will, opposing statistics where our gross receipts tax numbers have come in better than expected during those months, yet our unemployment numbers are certainly very high and concerning. And so we know that the small businesses are hurting, that folks have been laid off, and yet based upon the monetary stimulus in the economy, we think that that's caused these numbers to be better than expected, and potentially during those months providing some of the challenges that folks on average may be having in accessing this program. On the following slides, I won't go into great detail. I hope you'll find them informative. If you have time to review them after the presentation, I'm certainly happy to take questions. But what staff has attempted to do is to provide these same statistics in the various areas of the state that have some of the greatest underpinnings of economic activity based upon their size and the industries that dominate those areas, and to show you specifically how those top 3 industries that have been both successful and unsuccessful in this program, how their statistics for gross receipts tax in those periods fare out on an average basis, to give some idea as to, on average, how folks would fare in this program. One of the other things that we noted earlier in comparison to our peer programs in other states and cities is this idea around timing. And so we were launching this program in early August after taking just over 29 or just about 29 days to get it implemented. But you can see, and it's not completely consistent, but you do see fairly consistently that oftentimes the dip in all of these industries actually occurs just prior to the 2 months that are in the statute for purposes of qualification. Not in every case, but it's a fairly consistent theme that you'll find in these slides. And so on slide 21, you have Bernalillo County and the city of Albuquerque. Slide 22, we have up north, the city of Farmington and San Juan County. Another consistent theme you find throughout these slides and is evidenced in statewide averages is also that the arts, entertainment, and recreation tends to be one of the hardest hit throughout the state. And I believe slide 23 has the southern metropolitan area of Doña Ana County and the city of Las Cruces. And then I believe lastly we have the city of Santa Fe as well as Santa Fe County for your analysis and any questions that you might have for us. I think.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And Ms. Russell, anything else from you?
Mr. Chairman, this last page just shows overall the average drops between April of 2020 receipts by those industries that Adam went through, and its comparison for that the percentage drop over April of 2019, and then lastly, May of 2019. So you can see on average, only 2 of those industries had the declines of greater than 30% in both of those months. And as Adam said, we're using this information to inform how we can increase our education and outreach, and to provide you the information you need to make decisions as you move forward. And with that, we are happy to answer questions.
Thank you both very much for that very thorough presentation. Really appreciate it. Are there any questions from committee members in the chamber? Anybody on WebEx, you're going to have to raise your hand or chat at me if you're interested in asking questions. I've got quite a few here, but I know we only have about 20 minutes, so I'll try to be quick. First of all, I think a great deal of credit needs to go to you all at the New Mexico Finance Authority for, really putting this together. And I think it must be record time for a government program to be deployed and implemented the way you've done this. In what I know is a very efficient way. I've tested the application myself. I've had constituents who have actually received one of these loans, and it worked. Big props to the sponsors as well. I know Representative Marianne Matthews was contacting me back in April with this idea, as was Representative Damon Eli, and so it's good to see their idea come to fruition. Now, to my questions, Ms. Russell and Mr. Johnson, I think as you explained in your presentation, there's quite a bit of, there's many lessons here that we're learning. And I think, we don't have to rehash some of the things that you talked about, but, there are some things that jumped at me back in June when we voted for this bill, and they still jump at me now. My first question to you all, through the legislation, we created these sort of artificial requirements and artificial limits and whatnot. But based on your data and based on your experience, do you think that the $75,000 loan limit was too low?
Mr. Chairman, I think what we're finding is that certainly for those industries such as hotels, retail, restaurants, they have high expenses. And many manufacturers have high expenses. And so that is one thing we capped a lot of folks. 40% of those folks got capped at 75,000. So if you had increased the amount, certainly that money would have been utilized for business operations. We're certain of that.
Now, in terms of setting aside $400 million?
Mr. Chairman, for this program, yes.
In terms of setting that aside, I mean, obviously, that's a lot of $75,000 loans if you're going to use a $400 million. Now, you mentioned in your presentation, $100 million has been deposited. At this point, you've used roughly $22 million. The loan program ends in, 2 months? I don't think you're going to use the $100 million, and I'm assuming whatever is left over will go back to the severance tax permanent fund.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Now, in terms of, and I know the answer to this question, but I think for a lot of people watching and maybe members of the media, why is there an interest rate on these loans as low as it is? Why is there still an interest rate? And why isn't there an opportunity for forgiveness?
So, Mr. Chairman, this is an area that's somewhat outside of my expertise, so I'd look to someone with greater constitutional information, but we believe that because they're severance tax permanent funds, they cannot be granted because that would violate the anti-donation clause of the Constitution. And similarly, that the 0% interest would provide no return and potentially call that into question as well. That's my understanding.
Yeah, and your understanding is spot on, and I think this is sort of I don't want to say a warning shot, but certainly the anti-donation clause is well intentioned as it is in our state constitution. I think that it's a document written 100 years ago, and clearly in this instance it didn't work, and I'll tell you why. Right? I mean. We just spoke about $25,000 being too low for an operation that's maybe earning $3 million a year, but $75,000 for a small operation, a small coffee shop or whatnot, even at 1.6% interest rate, with the prospect of this pandemic continuing for another 18 months, and what that could mean for that business, being on the hook for $75,000 is a very scary proposition, right? So, I think that's something for us to think about as we learn the lessons of this pandemic is whether or not that particular clause needs to be readjusted, right? And obviously, we have the ability to amend the Constitution, and that's something that I would be interested in, especially for these purposes. I mean, I think it's a pretty obvious issue here. Now, you did mention that the Emergency Economic Relief Program, it's a $50 million program providing revenue replacement loans to cities and counties. Did I hear you say that there were no applicants for that?
Mr. Chairman, we have not implemented the program. It would take rules and application process, criteria, and much more policy work. We were looking first for some indication that it was necessary. We've not received any of that, any indication that that's of interest to anyone. We have a number of loans already with many of the borrowers, cities and counties that hit the criteria. And we have, we think, some more efficient ways of potentially helping some of them in the shorter term by restructuring loans or other things. So we're certainly trying to help those communities, but at this point, standing up an entirely separate program, it doesn't seem to be like there's clear need for it. So at this point, we don't believe we'll be implementing that program.
And that particular program, those $50 million, also revert back at the end of the year?
Mr. Chairman, yes, and we have not entered into any sort of agreement with the State Investment Council on those funds. So that $50 million is still being invested as it normally would, and the other $300 million is still being invested by the State Investment Council. So they've, through MOU, transferred over $100 million, and as you correctly mentioned, at the end of December, we will transfer back any monies that are undrawn.
So it's safe to say that the Emergency Economic Relief Program, it's not going to happen at this point?
Mr. Chairman, yes, barring some incredible unanticipated event, yes.
Thank you. I think it was Mr. Johnson that mentioned in his piece that perhaps part of the reason why the demand isn't there for these loans, and I did some rough math here, but I think 58% of those who applied actually qualified, and only 400 and change, or actually about 800 and change have actually even applied. But he mentioned, I think it was him or it was you, Ms. Russell, that part of the issue might be the great number of other loan programs and grant programs that are out there. You know, like I know the City of Albuquerque and Bernalillo County each had their own grant program. Obviously, the federal government had its own quasi-grant program through the PPP. I'm assuming that is a big part of the issue here, right? That maybe a lot of small businesses may not have had the need for this because there was that free money, essentially.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's part of it. I think New Mexicans are at their core conservative when it comes to financial matters. So certainly not wanting to take on loans until they absolutely need to, and given the number of loan programs that came before and even grant programs that are there now, that could be part of it. We also think that part of it is that the very specific requirement that they evidence the decline through reports provided to taxation and revenue unintentionally left out some industries that don't report their revenue to taxation and revenue. So our understanding is somewhere between 40 and 50% of economic activity in the state is not captured through those CRS reports, those reports to taxation and revenue. So there is very likely other industries we know of, because we've heard from the clients, that aren't able to be eligible for the program because the law requires that they have, that they give to us the reports that they provide to TRD, and they simply don't provide reports to TRD. So that other issue is really a big issue.
And just out of curiosity, what kind of industries are those?
Unfinished agriculture, I think certain mining, insurance,
Okay.
Certain medical. Adam, you're the economist here. I don't know when you're moving out.
All of those industries are folks that have been deemed exempt and don't have a reporting function the same way for us to pick up on, while they still are subject to probably other types of taxes. This one not. Another one that's come across is some of the transportation that come through the state have basically paid businesses in the state, but pretty much pay their taxes via the pump. Therefore, don't have a report required for this program.
Okay, thanks for that. Along those same lines, I know of a few businesses, very small businesses that might also fall in that definition there. For one reason or another. I know that there's some interest. I've seen reports in the newspaper to expand the program and I don't know, perhaps even make it a permanent program. I certainly appreciate the thought behind that. I mean, I do think that the program itself is an outside of the box kind of response to this pandemic and the economic impact that it's had on our small businesses. Have you been approached, and if approached, would you be willing to work with the legislature as this program gets fine-tuned? I think in our role as legislators, and obviously we're citizen legislature, and we, as much as we may want to, may not really have much authority other than during legislative sessions, right? And a lot of us have heard from small businesses in our community about the impact of the pandemic and the impact of the shutdowns. Certainly, there's a very real public health aspect to this that we cannot ignore. At the same time, I think government has the ability, particularly here in New Mexico, where we have these types of funds that are readily available. Would you be willing to work with the legislature to fine-tune the program and to maybe, maybe think about making something like this permanent? I mean, during good economic times, it would make a lot of sense for small businesses, maybe with certain requirements, to be able to access a 1.6% loan to launch their business. Is that something that would be of interest to the NMFA, given your expertise and given what you've done, as I said earlier, in record time to create this whole process, which I think really does work? I think the problem in demand and eligibility is actually because of the statute itself. It's pretty airtight for good reason, right? But I think that what you've done is pretty impressive. Would you be willing to work with us to maybe think about making this a permanent program?
Absolutely. We've learned quite a bit in this process, and so we would also recommend even bringing in experts from the Taxation and Revenue Department, Economic Development. But yes, we would be pleased to participate in those discussions.
Great, thank you. And then last but not least, I just want to congratulate you on your data, your demographic data. I don't know, was this part of the bill or was this you doing this on your own?
Mr. Chairman, we just thought it was information that we thought policymakers would want to have, so we collected it.
Well, I appreciate that. We had a presentation in LFC a couple weeks ago, and I think it was the county extension programs that came in and provided this just very impressive demographic data that they're not required to collect, but that really informs where we're at. And I appreciate you doing that as well, and I commend you for that. And please keep that up. Hopefully, you're doing this throughout all of your programs, because I think that's important. So. Seeing no further comments or questions from committee members, we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your time. We appreciate you, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you here in the next few months again. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for the time today.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Members, we're going to break for lunch now. We'll be back at 1 p.m., so we get an extra 6 minutes. Don't spend it all in one place. Thank you. I forgot my charger, so I got it. I'm very efficient with my computer use. No, it's, yeah, that flashlight or lightning. Hey, how are you?
I'm well, how are you?
I'm doing all right, thank you.
I was listening in on the conversation, and I just wanted to point out one additional thing for you if you're looking into potentially making adjustments to the anti-donation clause for this particular piece.
Yeah.
Would be also needing to make adjustments to the severance tax permanent fund language in the Constitution as well, because it states that the legislature can direct investments, and so an investment would need to have a return. ROI. And so it's not that it couldn't be done. I just wanted to clarify if that's something that you wanted to pursue, that they would need to be done in conjunction.
You would need to have two.
Yep, you would need to amend the anti-donation clause, because that's one piece. Then you would also need to amend the severance tax permanent fund constitutional language that says what the legislature can direct.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that.
Sure.
Appreciate that. Good to see you. How's everything?
Good.